Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome. My name is Patricia Anderson. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm pleased to be the producer for this month's PSG First Mondays webinar. Thanks so much for joining us. For those of you that have not been with us before, I've got just a few announcements and before we get started here. This is a webinar format, so that that means that we cannot see or hear you, but that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. So we'd love for you to participate by posting your questions and comments to the Q&A, and you can do that at any time. Once again, we won't be able to see or hear you, but we do want to hear from you. Please use the Q&A. We also have received some questions that you all submitted ahead of time during registration, so thank you for that. And we'll do our best to get to as many of the questions as we can during our Q&A session. Thanks for joining us this morning. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paige.
Thanks, Patricia. And again, thanks for joining us. I think it's safe to say that this election is like no other. So many firsts and hopefully lasts. The rematch between two presidents, one current and one former. Donald Trump is the first person to try to seek a non-consecutive term as president since the passage of the 22nd Amendment in 1951. This will be the first election where a major party candidate is a convicted felon and found guilty of sexual abuse and facing other criminal cases. The first presidential election after a global pandemic, the first post-Roe presidential election. The impact of changes in election laws coupled with declining trust in the administration of elections and the institutions of democracy will have, as of yet, unknown impact in 2024. Increasing polarization and yet seemingly the reemergence of ticket splitting may make this a unique electoral moment. And this may be the last or one of the last presidential races where both candidates are baby boomers. The basic question is, how do we understand what is going on with voters beyond what the pollsters and pundits tell us? And what campaign techniques and strategies should we be relying on or testing? And what audiences do we need to address in a different way? So today we are really fortunate to have some of the most brilliant scholars in voting behavior and American politics join us. David Broockman of UC Berkeley, Luke Hewitt of Stanford, Christine Slaughter from Boston University, and Yamil Velez from Columbia University are our guest panelists, and we are honored to have you all. You've seen their impressive bios, and I would urge you to take the time to delve into their work more deeply. So now we will begin with David. I have had the pleasure of working with David when I was president of the Voter Participation Center and also in my post-VPC work. His work is groundbreaking and changed the way American politics and political behavior is understood and practiced. He has had so many well-deserved awards, including the most recent 2024 Andrew Carnegie Fellowship. David.
Thanks so much, Paige, for that really kind introduction and for this opportunity. I'm really looking forward to hearing everyone's questions. So let me, can everyone see my screen? Yes, okay.
Yes, we can see you, David, thank you.
Great. So I'm going to just present a brief overview of some of the research I've done on the theme of echo chambers and breaking through them. So this idea of echo chambers, I think, is obviously especially important with what's been happening in our country over the last few years. It seems as though we have a lot of fellow citizens who live in kind of an alternate reality. And there's actually been some debate about whether or not these echo chambers are real or not. And so one of the things I've worked on recently with my collaborator, Josh Calla at Yale, is some research documenting that these echo chambers are in fact very real. We've done a couple of research papers on this. The first just looks at the data on what people watch on television. And it might seem kind of obvious, like, well, of course, we just, we do surveys, we ask people what they watch. We know a bunch of Republicans watch Fox News, but actually it turns out people are not really good and they lie on surveys when we ask what they watch. And so in our research, for one of the first times, we got data from a bunch of different sources where we don't ask people, but we have the real data from their televisions or from Nielsen tracking what they watch, not just having them self-report. This is one of the graphs from our paper. If you look at all adults, you can see that a solid share of the American population is watching over 8 hours a month of partisan networks. And I just want to draw your attention on this busy graph to two things. The first is if we look at Republicans, 20% of registered Republicans watch over 8 hours of Fox News on the average month. So that's 1 in 5. On the other hand, if we look at all Democrats, about 15% of all Democrats are watching at least 8 hours a month of CNN and MSNBC. This is from data from 2021 and 2022. So there's a lot of people who are really focused on just watching their side and don't watch the other side. And these habits are really sticky. This is another figure from our paper finding that if you look at how much Fox News or CNN or MSNBC people watch one week, if you watch 20 hours a week of Fox News one week, you're very likely to be watching almost 20 hours a week of Fox News the next week. So people have these habits where they watch the media that is on their side and they stick to really just watching that media. And we've also done some other research finding that these echo chambers matter. So this is another graph from that last paper where what we've done is shown you, if you basically look at Democrats and Republicans, what percent of them watch kind of various amounts of the two networks. So for example, this bin that I've just circled here shows you if you look at all Republicans with cable subscriptions, 34% of them both watch over 8 hours of Fox News a month and less than an hour a week of CNN. So of Republicans with cable subscriptions, a third of them are like in these echo chambers where they're watching a lot of their side and none of the other side. And so what we've done in some of our other research is ask, well, what if you could pull people out of those echo chambers? What if you took those Republicans who watch a lot of Fox News and no CNN and had them watch the other side instead? So our question is, well, if we remove people from those echo chambers, does that actually matter? Which is another way of asking, do these echo chambers matter? If people weren't in them, would their minds change? And there's actually some research out there arguing that these echo chambers might not matter as much as you think. And in fact, if we tried to show people other information or break them out of their echo chambers, it would actually be counterproductive because of what's called the theory of backlash, that people, when they see things they disagree with, it's actually just going to dig them in more to their existing positions. So we did a study where we tried to assess that by recruiting these people who their televisions, the television data indicated they actually watched a lot of Fox News, and we paid them to watch CNN instead. So we identified these people, we recruited them to baseline surveys. We did an experiment, so just like a clinical trial in medicine, but for politics, where we randomly assigned half of people to be incentivized to watch to watch CNN instead of Fox News. The other half, our control group, continued watching Fox News as normal. And then we did a series of follow-up surveys where we asked them a lot of questions about things that had been on CNN and on Fox News during that time. And what we found was that this 4-week experiment, taking Fox News viewers and having them watch CNN, had really big impacts on how people saw the world. So this is just a few examples of the kinds of things that people were more likely to agree or disagree with. We had done this experiment in the late summer of 2020, a time that we all love to recollect. But for example, during that time, we found that people were more likely to admit that if Donald Trump admitted privately he knew COVID was more dangerous than the flu. They were more aware that COVID was killing many Americans every day. They were more aware that Donald Trump did not say he would accept the results of the election, and many more things like this. We also found that people's views, not just their beliefs about what was happening, but their views about Trump and about different issues changed dramatically as well. They're more likely to rate Trump as selfish. They're less likely to say that Trump was encouraging Americans to stay safe from and not spread COVID. And they were more supportive of a vote by mail. So we found all of these kinds of broad impacts across the topics that were in the news then. So I think that's, that set of research suggests these echo chambers do matter. And I know I'm going quickly with my short time. And I'm happy to answer questions about this, of course. But obviously, it's a little bit hard. It's not a scalable intervention to take everyone out there watching Fox News and pay them to watch CNN. That's really expensive. So I think that's proof point that even the people who we think of as the hardest to persuade might actually be persuadable. Okay, so what can we actually do as practitioners to try to harness some of that and persuade people? So my work is focused on a few different themes, some of which I don't have time to get into right now. I've done work on how opening voters' minds through listening and stories seems like it makes a difference. We have some studies showing that interpersonal conversations involving listening and telling people stories can be very effective. We have more work on that ongoing right now. I have other work that I've done, including with Paige in the past, finding that it's really important to tell voters things they don't already know. I'm a little bit of a dissenter from some of the campaign consensus that we've got to stick pick one message and stick to it for the whole campaign. My view is if people have heard something for the 50th time, even if that was the right thing to say the first time, maybe tell them something they haven't heard already if that thing hasn't persuaded them yet. And one thing I want to talk about a little bit that I think some of the other panelists will talk about as well is that to persuade at scale, we also need the infrastructure to find out what's persuasive. So in some research with Luke Hewitt here, who I think will talk about this a little bit as well, we have some data from the platform Swayable. This is a really cool data set we analyzed where a lot of different Democratic campaigns uploaded ads to test, to figure out, okay, here's, say, 4 ads I could use to try to persuade people to vote for this Senate candidate. Which of the ads is best? Lots of campaigns had done those experiments over the course of the 2018 and 2020 election cycle. And in our paper, we used all the data from all those experiments, over 500,000 respondents, to try to look across and ask, okay, what are the pattern in what works? And our answer is there actually is no answer to what works. What works is actually constantly changing. So this graph on the left is, I'm sorry, I'm showing you a bunch of busy graphs, a graph where we look at all these different hypotheses and then how they do across different election cycles. And what I've just circled here shows you that in 2018, so that's the column, focusing on issues was especially effective. And if you think about 2018, that kind of makes sense. 2018 was the year Democrats were running against what the first Trump Congress had done on the corporate tax cut and on the really unpopular HCA and Obamacare repeal. That was a great year for Democrats to talk about issues. That doesn't mean that every year is a great year for Democrats to talk about issues, though. We found that if you look just to the right of what I circled, in 2020, in down ballot races, in down ballot ads and in presidential ads, it turns out that those issue ads were actually not any better. If anything, they were probably a little bit worse. So to us, what this indicates is that, well, look, we do see that some ads do much better. If you pick 2 ads at random, our best guess is one is going to be 50% better than the other, but it's really hard to come up with just a general theory of here's what makes a good ad across all elections. It's constantly changing. So for us, the implication is this is why testing is so important. Is that it's really hard to predict what's going to work in any given election. Every election is different, as Paige said at the outset. This one is certainly very different in many ways than others, and so that's why this kind of testing is so important. And so because you can test the same hypothesis in 2 elections and get different results. On the other hand, for example, in the 2020 presidential election, contrast ads worked really well. Maybe that'll be true again this year. Maybe it won't. It wasn't in 2018. Contrast ads weren't any better. But however, what we do in this paper is some math to ask, well, what % of a campaign's budget should be spent on just this investment in message testing and figuring out what works? And our back of the envelope math says the answer is around 10%. So I don't know, it's not a hard and fast number, but it's just to say a lot of money should actually be invested in trying to figure out what messages are best. Because if you find a better message, it might be 50 or even 100% better than the message you'd use typically. Now, I know there's a lot of people on this call who are a lot of experts, and we also, this is some work with Josh Kalla and some of our PhD students. Another way that you might try to figure out what messages work is not to collect data, but to rely on gurus or your own intuition. And so in some recent work, we took a lot of messages that political practitioners had used to try to persuade on lots of issues, and we asked political experts to predict what works. And in this graph, what you're seeing on the x-axis is in an experiment how effective different messages were. Every dot in this graph is a message. And on the y-axis, we're showing you the average predictions for the effect of those messages, either for practitioners in the pink or for members of the mass public in the blue. And what we find here is that the practitioners and the mass public, they can predict a little bit, but barely. And so that's, again, part of why we think this testing is so important, is that our own intuition or hypotheses from previous elections just aren't that good at predicting what works in any given elections. So the implications here I see of this work is that these echo chambers really matter. They're making people hard to persuade. Persuasion is difficult, but it is possible. We see it most often when people see stories and are in context where they're going to actively process, maybe because of what we're telling them, maybe because we're listening to them, when we expose people to novel information, and when we have an infrastructure that allows us to find the messages that are most effective, that will allow us to figure out what works. So thank you, and I will turn it over to the next person.
David, before we turn it over to Luke, I just have a quick clarifying question from the audience for you that I
Yeah.
want to put in now. Christian is asking if there was a reason in particular that you used CNN instead of MSNBC.
Yeah, so we did this experiment in 2020, and our hunch, which might have been wrong, is that taking like diehard Fox News viewers and taking them all the way to MSNBC might be like a bridge too far, and they might reject it. CNN in 2020 had not yet taken its kind of turn back to the center. It was very much kind of like anti-Trump news all the time. And so I think it was like definitely very different than what they were seeing. And like CNN at the time was, I think, definitely left of center. Now I think it's a little more unclear. But that was why, is that we thought MSNBC might be like a bridge too far, but we would love to do this experiment again if someone wants to. Fortunately, it's very expensive. Someone wants to
Right.
support doing this again.
Yes.
But that was why.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that. And now we'll hear from Luke.
Great. Let me just share screen. Can you see my screen?
We can. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. David has just been emphasizing the importance of testing, which is something I'm really going to echo in my talk. But I'll also be talking about new research on how we can know what to test in the first place in order to design more effective messaging for persuasion campaigns. And I want to just start by summarizing a couple of very high-level findings from the last few years of persuasion research. The first finding is that messaging choices really matter a lot. When we look at randomized control trials that compare a range of messages and the same persuasive outcome, we usually see this fairly wide distribution of persuasive effects, where the best performing messages have almost double the impact of the average message, while the worst performing messages have essentially no impact at all. We've seen this pattern in studies persuading people to support electoral candidates. We've seen it across studies aiming to change people's minds on issues like climate change, and also in arguments of political policies on issues like immigration or basic income. Across all these domains, the finding is pretty consistent that the top messages have almost double the impact of typical messages. The second finding, though, that David alluded to earlier, is that despite all of this research that's gone into studying persuasion, experts and scientific theories are still surprisingly poor at predicting which messages will persuade the public. So in our work looking at the impact of political ads tested by Swayable, we tested these 30 theories of persuasion. They're in the rows of this graph that David showed earlier. And we found that none were reliable predictors across contexts of whether an ad would be effective at increasing candidate support. On policy support, David mentioned just now his work showing that political practitioners are almost completely at chance at predicting the persuasive effect of different messages. There's almost no correlation here between experts' predictions and the measured effects. And again, we see this same finding in other areas like behavioral science. So here's a study from Katie Milkman testing the impact of SMS messages to encourage flu vaccination, where she finds, again, that experts are completely at chance at predicting which messages would be most and least effective. I think the truth is that predicting what persuades the public is actually just a really hard problem. It can depend on so many different features of the message, of the audience, and of the broader context, which changes over time. It's really not clear which of the lessons learned in one cycle will carry over to the next one when so much has changed. So it's maybe no surprise that even experts can't do this reliably. But then where does this all leave us? If predicting persuasion is so hard, then what are the implications for practitioners? Of course, the biggest implication is the importance of testing. If campaigns have a lot of uncertainty about what will persuade, then the most important thing they can do is pre-test, test their ads and messaging before running with it. But of course, there's limits to what pre-testing alone can achieve too. If only a small range of the possible messages ever get tested in the first place, which are those written and selected by the experts, it means we might well be leaving on the table some much more effective possible messages because they're just very different to any of those that experts would have even thought to test. And so the main question I want to address today is, what other options do we have? How can we create more effective messages than experts can? There's lots of new work that I'd love to talk about here, and in the interest of time, I'm going to mention only 2 recent projects that I think are especially actionable for practitioners. One is on using crowdsourcing instead of experts to craft hundreds of persuasive messages. And the other is about running simulated experiments using AI to predict which of a set of messages would be most effective. Okay, so to start with, I'll talk about methods for crowdsourcing persuasive messages from the general public. And let me just give a few reasons why I've been so excited about this approach. The first reason is simple, which is that by sourcing messages from a wider range of people, we can collect a far more diverse set of messages to test than just what experts would write. And so we better cover the range of possibilities. The second is about representation. So if you're working for a campaign to create persuasive messages on an issue, you're likely very committed to it. And you also probably have a very different background and experience and worldview to the undecided voters who are your intended audience. And so I think this disconnect between the person crafting the message and the audience can be a real barrier. And then lastly, over many studies, when we keep testing new messages written by the same set of people, then over time, we might be able to work out who are the super persuaders. Are there any people who really can, perhaps better than experts, predict what will persuade the public? Okay, and so to run these studies, we built a platform called crowdvocate.org, which is what we use to run message writing tournaments. For each tournament, we'll work with a campaign that wants to persuade the public on a particular issue and wants to find new messaging that they might not have thought of themselves. The campaign decides on the specific outcomes and the rules, and then the users of the platform all compete to write the most effective messages. And once the submissions are in, we test them all in a large adaptive RCT experiment, which means that we run it in multiple stages in order to zero in on the top performing messages. Then when the results are in, the winning users are awarded a cash prize, and they also get status on their leaderboard, which shows who's written the most persuasive messages across all of the studies so far. And so just to give you a flavor of who those people are, half of our top performing users gave their party affiliation as independent or other. And 70% of them have no academic or professional experience in communication or public opinion. So these are really different people to the experts that usually craft messages for campaigns. And the results we've been seeing from these tournaments have been really very promising. We've now run RCTs like this on about 20 different issues over the past couple of years, starting actually before we built the Crowdvocate platform. And we've consistently discovered that top crowdsourced messages are more effective than benchmark messages from campaigns and experts and official sources, usually improving upon them by at least 50%. And so we've been really very motivated by these results and the success that we're finding in crowdsourcing messages from the public. So if you're interested in sponsoring a tournament on the platform, then please do get in touch. The second piece of actionable research that I wanted to highlight is an AI project that I and a few collaborators have spent the past year working on at Stanford. And the motivation is this. Say you've come up with 100 or 200 messages, and you want to test them to find the most effective, but you can't run an RCT study big enough to compare them all with any statistical power. One way you might want to narrow the field is by using AI to predict what the results of an RCT study would be, and then test only the messages that seem the most promising. So we designed an approach for using large language models just like this to simulate the results of human experiments. The model takes as input a message and an audience and a target attitude, and then it simulates what would happen if you were to run the RCT experiment on hundreds of people and outputs a predicted treatment effect. So to validate the model, we put together an archive of about 800 unpublished treatment effects measured in RCT studies spanning fields like political science and public policy, etc. And we found that the model's predictions actually tracked really well with true treatment effects. The correlation here is about 0.8 or 0.9, which is better than human forecasters. And these are all unpublished studies, so we know none of them were in the training data. And when we look at mega studies designed to compare the effects of many treatments on the same outcome, like the Katie Milkman vaccine study I mentioned earlier, we find that the model matches or surpasses experts at predicting which messages would be most effective. So we think our approach could be an extremely useful tool for researchers and campaigns looking for a way to prioritize messages to test. To share the model, we've also built a web tool where researchers can run simulated experiments. You just select an audience and write a few messages and click go, and then the model runs a simulation and gives you the predicted RCT results. We use a version of this same model ourselves in our own adaptive experiments, and we found it very useful for searching the space of persuasive messages more efficiently. So we're excited to see how others will use it. And I think that's all I have time for. So thanks for listening. If you're interested in using either of the tools I just mentioned or supporting us with funding to help scale them up, then please get in touch. And of course, huge thanks to all of my academic collaborators who worked on these projects with me.
Thank you so much, Luke. Dr. Slaughter?
Yes, I am here. Let me pull up the slides. Okay, can everyone see my slides?
Yes, ma'am.
Great, perfect. Okay, good morning, everyone. And first, thank you to Paige for organizing. Again, I'm Christine Slaughter, and I will talk very briefly about Black women as voters. So first, why might we want to focus on Black women in politics? Well, first, we see Black women's political participation outpaces both white men, white women, and Black men. And we can see this trend going back to the 2008 election, leading into 2012, while the data stop here, going on to 2016 and 2020. So Black women are over participating in political and electoral politics, but also we see the rise in the number of Black women in the United States Congress, both Republicans and Democrats over time. And what my collaborators and I, Nadia Brown and Camille Burge, are interested in understanding the behaviors of Black women in the electorate at the intersection of their race and gender. So first, with intersectionality, it's going to recognize the complexity and the overlapping nature of systemic disenfranchisement and the varied effect of power across difference. And the unique perspective that we bring to our projects and our research is that we look at Black women in isolation. So many studies in politics look across kind of the most dominant force in politics, which is ideology. But we believe that there's something to be said looking across race and gender, revealing power differences between Black women and other groups. Again, why we focus and think about Black women is that we've all seen in the media that Democrats have leveraged and recognized Black women's electoral strength and their civic duty to engage in electoral politics. Research that we see again on online political engagement doesn't necessarily disaggregate to look at Black women's views specifically. If we think about anger and emotions, we know that Black women are constrained by stereotypes and tropes that inhibit their ability to be viewed as angry. And if we think about women's suffrage and over-participation of Black women, we can see that they've only gained access to the ballot box with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So how we conducted our research is that we conducted a survey leading up to the 2020 midterm elections, where we surveyed 2,200 Black women across the United States, the majority coming from the South, where Black folks are concentrated, and we're balanced on education, income, and region, as I mentioned. And this is one of the largest efforts by academics to look at Black women's public opinion and political attitudes in isolation. How we conducted our analysis is that we looked at different survey items around the information sources that Black women consulted for the information. So we've heard a lot about Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, NPR. So we asked where Black women are receiving their news. And that's a piece that we've shared with the group. We've looked at the different emotions that Black women experience, particularly as Black women in politics, those being positive emotions and second order, such as pride, but also anger and fear, negative emotions that mobilize to engagement. We looked at Black women's political behavior on and offline and a few policy positions. In order to conduct our research, we just looked descriptively. There's richness in looking at the descriptives of Black women. So we're going to look across generational cohort, income, education levels, on their online political behavior and what they view as threats to democracy. So here are my three takeaways, the things that we've learned from this study that may be informative for organizations and groups looking to, one, conduct outreach more broadly, but also think specifically about how the needs and messages of different groups must tailor to their position within United States politics. So what we found was that only 26% of Black women said they were angry often during the 2020 presidential campaign because they were a Black woman. 32%, that's a plurality, of Black women in our survey viewed voter suppression as a top threat to the United States elections. And this is including responses such as foreign interference and also local tampering by political parties. So Black women view voter suppression as a top threat to the United States elections. And the majority of Black women in our sample, so 73% of Black women, were inactive online and do not post their political views on social media. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these together. So the first item I want to examine is which Black women were angry during the 2020 campaign. So as I previously mentioned, so anger is an emotion that motivates us to action. So if we feel angered, it's usually due to a grievance, an injustice, a way that we felt slighted. So we wanted to see if Black women who were more interested in politics, or let's say followed the campaign more closely, were more angry in the 2020, leading up to the 2020 presidential election. And what we find, so here is just a histogram where we look at anger, which is going to be going across vertically, and interest, which are the colored bars. So even what we can see here is that Black women, 13% of Black women who said they were angry all the time are those that are very much interested in politics. But conversely, 37% of Black women who were never angry during the presidential campaign are those that are not interested in politics. But we believe there's something interesting if we look at those in the sometimes and often category, that even folks who did not follow the election closely still expressed anger over the 2020 presidential campaign. So next, does Black women's public political expression vary across platforms? So again, thinking of the different social media platforms where Black women may engage in politics, we wanted to see to what extent does a traditional resource model of participation explain who posts on social media? So what we find is that if we look at income levels and social media platform engagement, platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter have the greatest participation among Black women, but we can look at differences by income. So in political science, we like to say that folks with more income have more recreational time to spend posting on social media and engaging in other activities to influence politics. And here we see that Black women across the income strata engage in posting on different platforms about their political views. But also we can see the inverse is that Black women with the fewest resources are engaging similar to their more higher income counterparts. So we believe this is interesting because when we go to look to talk to voters, particularly we can find Black women across a variety of platforms, and we're getting a real cross-section of Black women across income strata. And lastly, one thing we want to talk about is the greatest threat towards elections within the United States. And again, Black women, we find, view voter suppression as the primary threat towards elections in the United States. And this is over things that we've heard widely discussed, such as vote tampering by political parties and vote tampering by local election officials, foreign interference, and voter fraud. And one thing that I think is important to mention is even if we think about high-profile cases of voter fraud, they've largely covered folks of color, particularly Black women who've engaged in voting, perhaps under not the best conditions. So we take these three findings around voter suppression, anger in politics, and also social media engagement, just to say if we want to think about how do we motivate Black women as voters, one, we must consider how Black women feel about politics. That's informing how they engage. So again, I showed that Black women that were not interested in politics were also the least angry during the 2020 election. The traditional resource model does not explain Black women's political engagement online. So both across platforms and across income strata, Black women with the fewest resources also engage similar to their higher income counterparts. And lastly, Black women are most concerned about voter suppression. We know that after the Shelby v. Holder decision, Black folks in general lost a key protection of the Voting Rights Act, and therefore Black women remain most concerned about voter suppression relative to other threats. So I'll be more than happy to talk about other questions with the survey. If you want to learn more about us, we're in sistersinpolitics.com, and I will pass it over to Yamil.
Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here, and I share my screen. All right, so today I'm going to have a discussion, I guess, and summary of some of my recent work and how we might think about Latino voters going into the 2024 election, as well as a broader discussion about information environments. And so if we want to think about some important trends in American politics as we head into the 2024 election, we've had a lot of discussion about alleged cracks in partisan coalitions, the specter of online misinformation, concerns over America's first AI election. And what I want to argue is that anxiety about these trends have a basis in reality, but some of these fears may be exaggerated, or we have to kind of heavily condition them. And so there's been a significant amount of media attention drawn to Latinos since 2020, with discernible increases in Trump support in Latino-heavy areas and polling data of Latinos suggesting some shifts within the community. But whether these shifts are politically consequential depends on some simple math. And part of this is thinking through exactly how these group shifts are then translated into votes. And so there is work by a group of scholars at Stanford and the University of Pennsylvania, specifically looking at how shifts in specific subgroups translate into net votes. And what these scholars have highlighted, Will Marble, Justin Grimmer, and Cole Tanigua Lau, is that whether a candidate receives increases in net votes depends on changes in turnout within a subgroup, changes in vote choice and composition. And the main argument here is that you might have specific groups that are, let's say, shifting toward a specific candidate, but that is then accompanied by decreases in turnout. And so it ends up being a wash. And so basically, we have to take into account these factors when thinking about whether shifts within the Latino community or other communities in American politics actually translate into electoral outcomes. And so with a project co-authored with Bernard Fraga at Emory University and Emily West at the University of Pittsburgh, what we find is that Trump gained votes among more ideologically and attitudinally conservative Latinos from 2016 to 2020. And this was among Latinos who self-described themselves as more conservative, those who were more supportive of law and order approaches, those supporting immigration restrictionism, and some shifts among Catholics. We also observed some evidence that among lower socioeconomic status Latinos, those who had less than a college degree or were lower in income, that these groups grew more fond of Trump over time. And so what we try to do with this piece, and I think what is important as we head into 2024, is to really understand the different subgroups of the community and why messages by Trump and the Republican Party might resonate with some and potentially backfire among others. And so our kind of push in this paper is to really encourage more thinking about heterogeneity within not only the Latino community, but communities of color more broadly. In this piece, we try to push back against some alternative explanations that have been offered, I think, since 2020. Some have argued, for instance, that this was the result of COVID-19 lockdowns that disproportionately affected Latinos, that this was part of an anti-Black Lives Matter protest backlash, or that it was simply the result of online misinformation. What we want to argue, and what some of my follow-up studies have suggested, is that the evidence is most consistent with an ideological sorting pattern, where more conservative Latinos are now starting to align these preferences with their vote choice increasingly. And so in the paper, we went through these various explanations. We found that if we look at over the course of the election, that these COVID lockdowns did potentially decrease support for Biden over time, but this was not necessarily disproportionately affecting Latinos. And so we observed decreases in vote intent as states implemented more lockdown measures. But in fact, the coefficients were generally larger among non-Latino than Latino voters. Looking at the Black Lives Matter explanation, we didn't find any sizable drops in Biden support, shortly after the protests broke out. And so we don't really find that as a credible explanation. We also looked at heavy social media users to see if the shifts were concentrated among Latinos who mostly relied on social media for political information. We didn't observe much evidence there. Instead, what we believe is happening is this ideological sorting pattern of aligning, more conservative attitudes, more conservative orientations with vote choice. And I actually have a project, which I'm glad I have, a great group of folks here looking at persuasive effects and AI, where basically I try to elicit core issues among Latinos. So ask them, what is your most important issue? And on the fly, create these conjoint experiments where people are deciding between candidates that vary in terms of immigration policy and also that core issue, which might be abortion, gun control, whatever it is that might be important to the individual Latino voter. And these studies have suggested that the core issue actually generally tends to beat out immigration. And we've done it multiple ways, and have found that, we even find, for instance, Latino supporting hypothetical candidates that are aligned with them on their core issue, even if they're taking restrictionist positions on immigration. And so I think this is an important kind of method for us to unpack this heterogeneity within the Latino community. There might be, for instance, some pro-life voters within the community that are willing to accept some of the more kind of restrictionist stances that Trump and the GOP have been taking. And so, in general, the evidence suggests that shifts in Latino support are real, but they're largely contained among Latinos who may have already been predisposed to vote for Trump. Democrats are still receiving a majority of the Latino vote, so this is not a racial realignment as it's been described. I also think that shifts in other communities of color are less clear. A lot of it depends on whether you're using voter-validated data or not. One kind of conclusion that I've reached, I think, and my collaborators have reached, it's unlikely that conservative Latinos will revert to their old voting patterns. But when looking forward to the Latino vote, a lot of this will hinge on young Latinos who are aging into the electorate. And the younger Latinos tend to be a little more apathetic, a little less or less likely to identify with either party. And so this is one of the kind of important moving parts that we should consider as we look forward. So I think, given that a lot of my work is also focused on misinformation, it's worth, including this caveat about misinformation. And there's been a lot of concern about this. Polling data, some of my own work suggests that a majority of Latinos are not buying into falsehoods, but many are uncertain about the validity of online content. And if you look at the broader literature, misinformation and corrective interventions like fact checks, they generally have a small effect on attitudes and behavioral intentions. So, when we look at these shifts from 2016 to 2020, I think one of the prominent explanations was that this was, mostly due to misinformation circulating on WhatsApp. I think it's important to resist these monocausal explanations and grapple with why certain parties and candidates are not really resonating with these different Latino subgroups. And I think thinking more systematically about where that variation might come from, whether it's ideological positions, religion, or other factors. I also think, and I'm glad to be in a group of with other scholars who agree that leveraging artificial intelligence is an opportunity for us to improve public opinion research. So it's not simply this threat to elections; it's also a way that we can learn directly from voters in their own words, rather than forcing them into boxes, Likert scales, and so on. And so I have projects looking at misinformation detection within the Latino community, where I actually have people reporting basically what they're seeing online, and then this is then fed to future survey respondents using multi-armed bandit algorithms. And I think this is a useful tool for us to create online surveys that basically adapt to users. I also have projects looking at persuasion. So going back to David's point about backfire, how people respond to counter arguments that target core issues that they might care about. And so this research leverages AI, where basically people are receiving counter arguments on the fly, and then assessing how they respond. Do they backfire, or do they moderate? And this work has suggested that for the most part, we observe evidence of moderation, but we can observe backfire when vitriolic arguments are introduced. So I think this is a really exciting time. I also think that concerns about the rapid dissemination of misinformation are reasonable, but there's also potential for these tools to clarify the political environment and dynamically combat falsehoods on the fly. So some work by Thomas Costello, David Rand, and Gordon Pennycook suggests that these tools can be used productively as we approach a 24 election, where there might be a lot of falsehoods floating around. And so thank you so much, Paige and everyone else for joining. I really appreciate it. If you want to look up more of my work, you can see it at yamil.velez.com. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really, really so interesting. I have a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up. The first is, how do you determine whether or not a messenger is credible, and then what effect does that have on persuasion? Everybody speak up at once. Okay, David, I'll call on you.
Sure. Well, so I was going to say in the paper with Luke and others, this was actually one of the, I know I put up that big wall of, the different hypotheses we tested. On that big, wall of hypotheses, we actually did look at, at least at the highest level, some questions around messengers, like messenger gender, whether the messenger is a politician, whether the messenger was a healthcare worker, an everyday person, kind of a Republican who was saying, I'm a Republican, but I'm going to vote for a Democrat. And, to your point, we, in some cases, those messengers were way more effective. But which messengers are most effective, like everything else, really varied by cycle. So just looking, for example, we found that in, the 2020 down ballot races, Republican messengers were, really effective, but not so much in the 2020 presidential race. And so I think that just goes to show that, messenger is kind of one more lever we have that we should be thinking about. But again, like all these other levers, that it's not so simple as, well, here's the lever you should always pull. It really, you need the testing and the kind of technology that we've been talking about to figure out what, meets the moment.
And with what audience? Yeah, Luke, did you want to say something?
No, I'll just echo that. I mean, I will say that in our work on the swayable data, obviously we're also not in a position to disentangle, like one would expect that there's going to be a substantial relationship between the messenger and the message itself, and certain messages are going to work in the context of some particular message. And all those things are kind of confounded in the data. We can only pick up on an association. So that makes it harder too.
Anyone else? Christine, Yamil?
Luke, I'm wondering if on this you can, I know that you talked a little bit about it, your work on the follow-up work you've done with the swayable data on kind of targeting and the pros and cons of targeting. I don't know if you want to say a little bit about that.
Just moving on from messenger, we're just talking about targeting in general. Yeah. Okay, so I think targeting is a pretty hard problem. I think what we've seen from our work on the swayable data, and also some other studies that we've run, we've done various studies trying to look at the extent to which the most and least effective messages vary based on the demographics of the audience. Because the extent to which that's true, that means that there's going to be benefits to targeting. I would say that the broad summary of what we found is, yes, there is a substantial variability, or sometimes there is a substantial variability, particularly along, say, party lines. For example, like targeting a message to like Democrats versus Republicans, maybe different messages are likely to be effective in those cases. And so in principle, there can be pretty big gains to targeting. But what complicates the picture is that in order to find those messages in the first place, to do the testing, once you start cutting the cutting the population down into smaller and smaller groups, you just have much less statistical power to distinguish what are the effective messages for Democrats versus Republicans. If you run an RCT with 10,000 people, but only 3,000 of them are Democrats, 3,000 Republicans, suddenly you're starting to be very underpowered. And so the broad picture is that usually we'd say that if somebody runs a large experiment comparing a bunch of messages, the best thing you can do is just take the top message and run with that. And if you really are interested in targeting your message at a particular subgroup, then the way to do that is to design the experiment in the first place, reaching as many of those people as possible so you can actually be well powered to work out which messages are most effective on them. Otherwise, you can just be hurting yourself by looking at the subgroups in the experiment that you ran.
Patricia, you want to open up for questions?
Sure. I'm going to share one that came in ahead of time. This person is interested to hear about the novelties that you're seeing in social and digital media. And Christine, I'd love to hear from you on that first.
For sure, thanks. In terms of novelties that we're seeing in our work, just looking at where Black women are active or where they make political posts online, we've been following a lot of TikTok accounts around Black women generating their own content and sharing that with their wider audience. There are Twitter accounts that are particularly tailored towards African-American audiences that have been particularly interesting. And also, I guess one important thing to consider with Black women is where if we do not see online engagement, we know that offline engagement is happening through networks that disseminate messages, religious organizations, et cetera. So I would say creative platform engagement, but also we keep in mind the things that don't rise to the surface of public conversation are often happening within smaller networks.
Cool, thank you. Would anybody else like to comment on that question? Yamil, I see you thinking hard.
So I've been doing some work looking at, for instance, if pieces of misinformation or fact checks or people are more responsive if they're coming from close family members versus, let's say, like acquaintances and so on. It's very preliminary, but not surprising. I think I'm finding some evidence that is aligned with these peer effects, specifically coming from closer ties versus weaker ties, actually. That's not novel content, but I guess it's novel, and then we're kind of digging into how misinformation and fact checks might resonate differently depending on the source within the Latino community. So speaking to this like WhatsApp discussion of that I think came out a lot after 2020.
Thank you. And then Yamil, I'd love to follow up with a question specific to your presentation from Joanne, who is wondering if Latinos are worried about mass deportation, the rounding up folks and putting them in camps, and all the efforts around DACA students and things of that sort. Did you find any of that in your research?
So, when you ask people about the most important issue, and specifically Latino voters, it is surprising how rare it is to actually see immigration pop up when you're just doing it in this more flexible, open-ended way. It turns out, if you actually look at open-ended responses, not only in some of the work I've done, but more recently by pollsters that focus on the Latino community, immigration has actually decreased in salience since 2016. And so it used to be top 3 issue in 2020. It was a top 10 issue. Now, I haven't looked at more recent polling, let's say like within the last couple of months, but this is one pathway for these ideological shifts to be occurring. So one of the arguments is that as immigration decreases in salience, then voters are relying on other issues to make their decisions. But I was struck by that, not only in the work I've been doing, but also looking at other polls that, again, are just asking what's your most important issue, and seeing that the Latino voters, immigration is not rising to the top like it was in 2016.
Thank you. And I think we'd love to hear from each of you on the sort of the premise of our webinar, which is what is different? What do you think is going to be different about the 2024 election? And what isn't going to be different about the 2024 election versus 2020? And we'll go, we'll go in the same order we started with. So we'll start with David.
Oh, man. Well, I think, on the one hand, I would say, sometimes there's an effort every election cycle to kind of reinvent the wheel. And I think there's certain things, right, that we know, are tested across a lot of different cycles, especially when it comes to like voter registration and turnout, social pressure mail, certain, voter registration programs. And, I think for progressive funders and groups, kind of not abandoning the things we know work and, making sure those are fully funded, I think is going to be, important, and not get like distracted by the shiny objects of whatever is new. At the same time, I think persuasion, my guess, is going to be especially challenging in this election, because we've got two candidates voters know a lot about. And I do think a lot of persuasion is people learn things about candidates that they didn't know before, that change their minds, and people just know a lot about these candidates. And I think that's just gonna, when it comes to persuasion, make all the more important, some of these advances that you heard about today, and especially, thinking about, what, just not to repeat what's been said, but when we look at some of the shifts among Latino voters and Black voters and Asian voters, among, less engaged voters, being willing to do things we wouldn't normally do, and at least test ideas to say, look, we never would have tested this in the past, but let's try this audience, let's try this message. I think that kind of willingness to test and experiment and to allow the data to surprise us, I think will be very important.
I just want to say one thing that David mentioned, which is I, as everyone knows, I do think testing is really, really important, and one should be deeply committed to it. But there's some lessons that we think we've learned that we do have to retest over a period of time. And so understanding what we have to test that's new in terms of techniques or messages, but also being very, very clear and smart about what we want to retest in terms of challenging our assumptions.
Thanks, Paige. Luke, same question for you. What's different?
Yeah.
What's not?
Well, following on that, I guess I would say on the retesting front, it's so hard to know, even if something was tested very recently, even within this cycle or something, there just might be a different context or a different messenger or a different audience or something. I just feel that it's really worth leaning into test, even when you suspect nothing has changed in the context. As for what else has changed, I don't know. It's a really hard question. There's a sense in which it feels like so much has stayed the same. We have two of the exact same candidates that we had last time. Obviously, technology has changed a lot. I maybe lean on the side of, when it comes to AI, the impact of AI, because it's just such a hot topic, I maybe lean on the side of actually thinking that it would be less impactful than many people would have speculated. Not that it won't eventually, but just some of the technology is not quite there yet to make a. But if you flat out ask ChatGPT to write a persuasive message for you right now, it will do it, and it will write an okay message. But it's not going to suddenly write a message that is like twice as effective as the average message. And so some of the speculation that kind of technology will like radically affect this election, I think, from what I've seen of the studies so far, I feel a little bit more conservative about claims like that.
Thank you, Luke. And I know we're running out of time, but I do definitely want to hear from Christine and Yamil on this question. So please go ahead.
Yeah, I will be brief. I would say one question that we had in our 2022 survey of Black women, we asked if they thought Kamala Harris was doing a better job or as expect or worked as expected. So how did they evaluate Vice President Kamala Harris? And 40% of Black women said that she performed as they expected. And I say that to say that I think what's different about this election is, yes, we have the same candidates, but we also are going through a severe enthusiasm gap around participation, especially for Black voters in particular, and looking across the gender divide for the Black electorate. So thinking about Black men's electoral participation as it varies from Black women's electoral engagement. So while we know messages are important, we also must consider the opportunities and structures that enable folks to feel efficacious in their vote and how they participate. Conversations around abstaining in politics have reached to a different level than they have in previous elections. So all in all, to say, while we have a lot of things that have changed, the voters are very much different in terms of who's entering and participating. So these are things we may want to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think on a similar note, as we look forward to 2024, my sense is that this idea of Latino voters as being kind of single issue voters, a lot of that is fading away. I think there is more. There are more folks approaching the community with nuance and thinking about heterogeneity among Latino voters. And so my impression, at least based on what I saw in 2020, where there was more kind of like national origin targeting, it's going to be kind of moving in that direction as well, but potentially more kind of issue targeting. I'm also kind of on the side of not worrying too much about AI during this election. As Luke said, like, I don't think the technology is quite there to create like super persuasive messages. But I think it will probably be used by campaigns in more subtle ways, like we've discussed, taking a lot of data, transforming it, making it more digestible. And so, yeah, I am hopefully cautiously optimistic, rather, as we look forward to 2024, about nuanced takes on the Latino community, but also nuanced takes on technology more and AI. So yeah, we'll see what happens.
I want to thank everybody and thank folks for joining, but I want to end with a question that I've been thinking about a lot. In terms of persuasion, messages are designed to evoke some kind of emotion, and connecting emotion, what emotion one is evoking with a message, and its relationship to persuadability. So what kind of emotions are we trying to evoke as we try to persuade people? Because that's how they come into, that's how they respond and process messages that candidates give them. Anyway, I'll leave that out there. Again, thank you guys so much. This was so interesting. Very much appreciate your time and your brilliance.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paige.